Now, in today's lesson, we're going to be going over Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar II, sometimes alternately spelled Nebuchadrezzar in Scripture, was king of Babylonia from 605 BC until 562 BC. Remember this date of 605 BC because that would be the beginning of 3 stages of the Babylonian captivity. It wasn't all just one conquering of Jerusalem, but it would begin with 3 stages separated with years in between, beginning in 605 BC. He is considered the greatest king of the Babylonian Empire and is credited with the construction of one of the 7 wonders of the world, as they're called, Hanging Gardens of Babylon. In biblical history, Nebuchadnezzar is most known for the conquering of Judah and the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem in 586 BC, which would be the culmination of the 3 captivities. Now, we'll get into greater detail on that in just a second, but first let's go over this because it's quite essential. Why are we talking about the conquering of Judah and not Israel? Well, it goes all the way back to the very first 3 kings of Israel, King Saul being the very first, King David, his successor, and then King Solomon coming after David. Now, whenever David ruled, he was a conquering king, and this is the landmass that Israel was at the time of King David and that of his son King Solomon. Though all of Israel, and that's including all 12 tribes of Israel, though they all loved King David, they had a major problem with Solomon because he was a big builder in Israel. He even built Solomon's temple. That took 7 years, and these buildings that he would have constructed, they would take years at a time and much labor. And the tribes, 10 of them notably, they had a huge problem with this, and after Solomon's death, they told Rehoboam, Solomon's successor, they said, look, lighten up on us or we're going to form our own nation to the north. And Rehoboam, as we all remember, he made the wrong choice, and he said, not only will I be as my father, but I'll be even stronger on you. He tried to rule by fear and all of this. So 10 tribes went to the north, creating the northern kingdom of Israel, and the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin stayed to the south, forming the kingdom of Judah. In 931 BC was the northern kingdom of Israel established. The competing world powers at that time were Egypt and Assyria. And as you can see, Israel, being that of the northern and southern kingdom of Judah, Israel constantly found themselves in between a rock and a hard place here, and this was a true test of God that he placed upon them because he constantly told them, don't rely upon Egypt, don't rely upon Assyria, call upon me. And we see time and time again over the next 400 years or so how they just kept calling either to Egypt or they would call unto Assyria. It would even be the Assyrians who, in 722 BC, would conquer the northern kingdom of Israel in no small part due to the aid of Judah's king Ahaz, who ruled over the southern kingdom, because these 2 nations, the north and the south kingdoms of Israel, they constantly battled back and forth. I made a video about King Ahaz, one of the most evil kings ever, king of Judah. I made a video about him, and it details all of these events, how he funded the Assyrians to come down and protect him against the northern kingdom and Syria and all of these. So Judah's king Ahaz, almost 200 years after the northern kingdom had been established, the southern king, he pays the Assyrians to come down and fight against the northern kingdom and their allies while leaving the southern kingdom of Judah open for Assyria to conquer. These 2 nations above Judah were like buffer zones that would keep Assyria at bay, but now Judah had basically funded their own demise. So in 722 BC, the fall of Assyria, the northern kingdom, occurred with the Assyrian captivity in the reign of King Ahaz, and this left his son and successor Hezekiah to take on this mighty Assyrian empire. And once again, we go over all of these details in our King Hezekiah study. The Assyrians would invade Judah during Hezekiah's reign, which led to the miraculous event recorded in 2 Kings 19:35, where God killed 185,000 Assyrians before the walls of Jerusalem in one night. Not long afterwards, as Scripture tells us, would certain messengers from Babylon visit King Hezekiah of Judah. Now, this would be after his illness, which was believed to be right around the same time. Hezekiah would show the Babylonians all the treasures within his palace and all the splendor of Jerusalem, boasting of a sort. After their departure, the prophet Isaiah rebuked Hezekiah for showing them all Judah's treasures. 2 Kings 20:17 tells us of this rebuke. Whenever Isaiah tells the king, "Behold, the days come, that all that is in thine house, and that which thy fathers have laid up in store unto this day, shall be carried into Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord." So Hezekiah would die about 15 years later, leaving his son Manessa, who is believed to be the most evil king noted of the Israelites. That's even counting the northern kingdom. And once again, I have a video detailing this King Manessa, exceedingly evil, then repentant. So wicked was this King Manessa that Jeremiah the prophet, who was the final prophet sent unto Judah right before the Babylonian captivity, and man, Jeremiah, he had a really hard time. You talk about a prophet in a very bad spot, very evil place. But in Jeremiah 15:4, we read this. This is the Lord speaking. "And I will cause them, Judah, to be removed into all kingdoms of the earth, because of Manessa, the son of Hezekiah, king of Judah, for that which he did in Jerusalem." Now, though we do read about Manessa repenting, his sins lingered and his influence lingered on the people. His idolatry, how he killed these prophets. It says that he slew innocent blood all over the place. Only 56 years after the death of King Manessa would Judah be totally conquered by the Babylonians. About 626 BC, during the reign of Manessa's grandson Josiah, the Babylonians began to rise in power. Babylon joined forces with the Medes and attacked the weakened Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire officially fell in 609 BC, leaving the remaining Assyrian soldiers to join their Egyptian allies at Carchemish. And Carchemish would basically be the place of the last stand for the remaining Assyrians. But 4 years later, in 605 BC, the prince of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, led the combined forces of Babylon and the Medes to victory at Carchemish. Nebuchadnezzar's father and Babylon's king, Nabopolassar, he was sick at Babylon at this time, and his son Nebuchadnezzar was leading the army. But Nabopolassar died shortly after the battle, pretty much immediately after the battle, as history tells us. He died shortly after the battle at Carchemish, making Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon in 605 BC. Now that occurred in the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah. Almost immediately in 605 BC, that same year, Nebuchadnezzar led Babylon into Judah. This would be the first of the 3 captivities. Now with this first invasion in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar would conquer the city, and he would take Daniel and others to Babylon. The prophet Jeremiah, who was preaching in Jerusalem at that time, the prophet Jeremiah preached during the most difficult years of Judah, God's message being not to rely on Egypt for protection, but rather surrender to Babylon. That was God's message. Surrender to Babylon, because they were already under basically a curse due to Manessa's sins. In 604 BC, about a year after the first invasion of Babylon, King Jehoiakim in Judah read the warnings of Jeremiah the prophet, cut them up, and burned them. It would be during that time, in Nebuchadnezzar's second year as king, as we're told in the book of Daniel, that he would have the prophetic dream of Daniel chapter 2. Young Daniel would afterward interpret the dream, revealing it as God's vision of the final Gentile kingdoms of the world, culminating in the millennial reign of Christ. It was a huge prophetic dream given to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now, for all the specifics concerning Nebuchadnezzar's dream and everything, I go over the entire book of Daniel verse by verse. You all can watch that for yourself. But for right now, our study is solely on King Nebuchadnezzar, so let's just keep moving along. About 3 years later, did King Jehoiakim of Judah rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, allying with Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar was at that time preoccupied with other wars within his kingdom, but eventually conquered Judah again in 597 BC. This would be the second captivity. Though scripture is vague on the matter, it is believed that Jehoiakim suffered a harsh death by the Babylonians, his son Coniah reigning after him. The 18-year-old Coniah only reigned for 3 months before being taken to Babylon, his uncle Zedekiah replacing him. And as clearly noted by this chart, Zedekiah would be the final king of Judah, and he would suffer a very harsh fate by Nebuchadnezzar, as we're about to learn during the third part of the Babylonian captivity. We once again have an entire video about King Zedekiah, the blinded final king of Judah. In the early part of his reign, Zedekiah had tried to procure the return of the exiles carried away in the last reign, as one can read in Jeremiah 29:3. And in his 4th year out of 11 that he reigned, in his 4th year he visited Babylon himself, not just sending messengers, but he actually went to Babylon himself, perhaps with the same object, to free the slaves that were already taken, and to satisfy Nebuchadnezzar concerning his loyalty, Jeremiah 51:59. Zedekiah did eventually rebel by, it's believed, turning to Egypt for assistance and refusing to pay the yearly tribute to Babylon. Babylon then laid siege to Jerusalem for almost a year and a half. It would be in Zedekiah's 11th year as king of Judah, in the year 586 BC, that the final stage of the Babylonian captivity would be finished. Jerusalem was destroyed, along with Solomon's temple and the king's palace. All the people would be taken to Babylon, except the poorest, to till the land. King Zedekiah would be brought before Nebuchadnezzar, where he would be forced to watch his sons be murdered right in front of him, then have his own eyes be put out before being taken to Babylon, where he would later die. The final stage of the Babylonian captivity occurred around the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign as king of Babylon. It's believed that it was around that time that the events of Daniel chapter 3 occurred. Nebuchadnezzar built a 90-foot tall statue overlaid with gold and commanded all people to bow to it at the sound of music. 3 of those taken into captivity with Daniel, almost 20 years before, named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow. Daniel was not present, it's believed. They were then brought before Nebuchadnezzar, who ordered them to be cast into a burning furnace for their disobedience. They were then thrown in bound, yet upon the king's observance, he noticed the men walking with a 4th man, who Nebuchadnezzar claimed himself appeared to be the Son of God. He then called for them to come out, where he praised God and made a decree, and I'm quoting scripture, that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Isn't it amazing how on the very day that Nebuchadnezzar, the most mighty king in the whole world, and the most mighty empire in the whole world, he builds this statue for all people to worship, and suddenly the true God shines far brighter than all of them, and no doubt the word of this would have spread throughout all the world. Once again, this is just another example like Jonah, Nineveh, and the Red Sea, Egypt, all the miracles, how God is showing all the Gentile nations how he is the true God. And he does it in the most mighty empires ever. He did it in Assyria with Nineveh. He did it in Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar. He did it in Egypt with the miracles, the signs. We're then told how Nebuchadnezzar then promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Once again, another sign of God's majesty involved. Not only was Daniel a prominent man within Babylon, but just like at the time of Esther, how God raises up godly people in order to rule the people and to promote his name throughout, so is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego raised up, and suddenly their God is known throughout all the land. In Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is given another dream by the Lord.
I looked and saw before me a tree in the middle of the land. The tree grew strong and tall. Its top touched the sky, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves, they were beautiful. Its fruit was abundant. The beasts of the field took shelter under it, and the birds of the air lived in its branches, and from it every creature was fed. Then I looked again, and I saw a messenger coming down from heaven, and he cried out aloud, "Cut down the tree, trim off its branches, strip its leaves, scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it, and the birds fly from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound in iron and brass, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let it be drenched by the dew from heaven. Let it live with the animals of the earth, and let its mind be changed from that of a man to the mind of an animal."
Daniel interpreted the dream for Nebuchadnezzar and informed him that the dream was a warning to the king to humble himself and recognize that his power, wealth, and influence were from God, not of his own making. God can cut any king down at any moment that he pleases. Nebuchadnezzar did not heed the warning of the dream, so God judged him as the dream had declared. Nebuchadnezzar, the mightiest man in the whole world, was driven insane for 7 years. When the king's sanity was restored, he finally humbled himself before the true God. Now, many people believe that Nebuchadnezzar converted to faith in the true God before his death, and I would believe that as well. According to chapter 4 of the book of Daniel, God refers to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant 3 times in the book of Jeremiah. After a reign of 43 years, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, died in 562 BC. His final recorded biblical words being, and I'm quoting Daniel chapter 4, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase."